Hello, and welcome to the Armen Show podcast. Science, people, creativity, learning more. The moments are for all of us. Glad to have you subscribing. Subscribe if you haven't on YouTube. Leave a review, Spotify, wherever it might be, Apple. The show continues forward. On this episode here, we have joining us the author of this fine book, A Molecule Away from Madness. The author is Sara Manning Peskin. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on here. Dr. Sara Manning Peskin, by the way. Tales of the Hijacked Brain. To me, the brain is the most important part of us. And to me, it's actually the most interesting part probably of the whole planet, because what can do more manipulation or movement or activity than the brain on the planet? Not so many things. Water doesn't really think its way through life. Now, before we get into the book, I would like to do a quick bio here. You're an assistant professor of clinical neurology at the University of Pennsylvania, and your writing has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe magazine, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. You are coming from Pennsylvania. What has taken you to Pennsylvania? Why are you in the field that you are in?
I grew up in Boston, and then I came to Philly for medical school, and then I've been here ever since. But
That's pretty cool.
I suppose I ended up in neurology mostly for the same reason I ended up in cognitive neurology, which is my subspecialty. And it's basically because I'm most interested in how people think and sort of the way that people's identities can change.
Actually, on that one, this is before the book content, how much can people's identities change? Is it at a certain age at which we are no longer really malleable plasticity-wise? Where are we at there?
Yeah, so cognition changes even in normal people. And we talk about this often with our patients, that we have this idea that we're supposed to be as good as we've always been for the rest of our lives, or maybe we have some senior moments. But in reality, if you think about cognition in sort of two categories, you think about it as crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Both of them get worse eventually. Crystallized intelligence is things like, why do we have a parole system? It's facts. And that tends to get better and better and better till about your 60s and 70s. And then for the most part, that all gets worse after your 60s and 70s, even in normal people. The only exception is actually vocabulary. Vocabulary seems to be sort of resistant to aging, or resistant to normal aging, I guess I should say. But then there's fluid intelligence, and that's things like reacting to the environment around you, finding a word that you need in the middle of a sentence. You get to a detour and you have to navigate around it without a GPS. All of that starts getting worse in your 20s and then just gets worse the rest of your life. And so we really are, normal cognition evolves over time.
That's interesting about the vocabulary. It's not really...
Yeah, that it's sort of the exception. It becomes more difficult for us to pull up the words in conversation, but when you point blank ask someone, what does X mean, that actually, at least in normal people, stays relatively stable.
That's good to know. I like vocabulary words like facetious and grandiloquent and erudite, things like this. These are great. Long live vocabulary. Now, you're a neurologist. What is the big differentiator from that versus neuroscientist? The separate fields that are related. What's the biggest distinguisher that you identify with?
So there are certainly people who are neurologists and neuroscientists. I think a lot of people identify neuroscience more as a sort of basic science field. It's someone who's more in the sort of PhD research type track. Whereas I'm more of a clinical person. So most of what I do is seeing patients. I do some clinical research visits. So for people who enroll in research studies, I may do some of their evaluations as part of those research studies. But I'm not, I don't have my own laboratory. I'm not using a pipette in petri dishes all day and things like that.
Darn, I was about to ask about pipettes and petri dishes and graduated cylinders.
No, I started a PhD. I started off in a combined MD PhD program. Normally you start medical school and then you do your PhD and then you finish medical school. And I got about a year into my PhD and decided I didn't want to finish it. So no, I very much don't have as strong a research background as a lot of people.
Fair. That is cool. Graduated cylinders have a lot of milliliters on them for people that are wondering. They sometimes go up to 100, and it's really exciting out there. Now, I throw little bits in It's always good. In your book, which we are going to cover, you have a variety of patients. You look at each one in detail in relation to a circumstance of theirs and what it tells us about how the brain can be hijacked in a form. What caused you to choose this set of patients? Were they representative of some of the most common or most noticeable features? What was the defining trait there?
So a lot of the things that I wrote about are not particularly common syndromes. I wanted to cover diseases that bring up different issues in neurology. So I divided the book into 4 different sections based on different kinds of molecules, and I wanted to make sure to cover diseases that are caused by those different kinds of molecules. And then I looked for what patients that I have access to, or did colleagues have access to, who had interesting stories, who were interested in talking about them. And that's sort of how I filled it out. I started off really with a larger list of syndromes that I was interested in that would sort of fit the pattern, and then it got narrowed down based on what I had access to.
That's cool. The expansion, consolidation framework of putting together something is a wonderful item. You have to have the most at the beginning, and then what are the main ones I'm putting in there? One of the main ones that has made it in this case is the story of Lauren. Lauren knows about something that's in sci-fi movies a lot, the zombie apocalypse. How is Lauren's story connected with zombies and their potential showing in her existence?
Yeah, so this is a story about that I use pseudonyms in the book, but I tried to keep most of the other parts accurate. So Lauren was a young woman who grew up in somewhat adverse circumstances and really excelled academically. She did extremely well. Her mom was very supportive, and she ended up going to an elite university, and then she came back the summer after graduation, and she started watching The Walking Dead. And this was back in, it was 2016 or so, and The Walking Dead was a huge hit, and she was watching them over and over and over again, sort of binge watching. And she woke up one morning and asked her mom, what do they want to have for breakfast, and they eat breakfast together. She goes back to sleep, and then she wakes up again and asks her mom what's for breakfast, which is a little weird because she just eaten breakfast. Her mom sort of thought twice about it. And as the day goes on, Lauren's memory seems to get worse and worse. She can't really seem to encode anything. She can't keep any new information. And she starts getting a fever, and she gets really unsteady on her feet. And so her mom says, I think we should go to the hospital. I'm worried about you. And so her mom takes her to the car. They go to the hospital. They end up in a hospital bay. And a doctor comes into the room and starts asking her questions. And in the middle of the questioning, Lauren starts essentially having a psychotic attack or a psychotic episode. And she throws her mom to the ground, and they call for security. There's like 9 security guards that come and have to drape themselves on her to try to hold her down. And she starts calling people by names of characters in The Walking Dead. And one of the security guards actually is the one who picks up that that's what's going on. It's a security guard who must have watched the show and recognized the names and recognized what was going on, because her mom had no idea of the connection. Her mom had never seen the show. And but Lauren gets admitted to the hospital, and nobody can really figure out what's going on. They do all these tests, and all the tests seem to look normal, but she obviously isn't acting normal. And her mom actually comes across an article about young women who have acute psychotic episodes. And she brings it up to the doctors and says, do you think this could be what's going on? It was an article about an autoimmune disease that causes that. And the doctors say, I don't think that's what it is. And they do more tests, and lo and behold, they can't find anything. And eventually they agree to send her to a bigger hospital where they actually diagnosed this disease that her mom had identified in an article. And she gets treated for the disease. And the way the disease works is actually Lauren actually had a tumor on her ovary, and nobody had known about the tumor. It wasn't big, and it wasn't causing a problem in terms of the size of the tumor, but her body had tried to create antibodies that would attack the tumor. But the cells in the tumor look a little bit like nerves, and a little bit like brain cells. And so when her body went to attack the tumor, it actually created antibodies that also attacked things that were in the brain, and it caused her brain not to work correctly and to actually essentially function as if she was on PCP. It's the same type of mechanism. And so eventually she actually got treated. They took out the tumor, they treated her with medications to decrease antibodies, and then she was released to the hospital, and she's doing well. And that's a case of something where the disease itself was only really discovered about 20 years ago, or less than 20 years ago. So 25 years ago, if she had showed up at the hospital, she would essentially have been sent to a inpatient psychiatric unit, and she may have never gotten out.
So it's actually kind of like she would feel that she was on the drug PCP in that condition?
Yeah, so at a molecular level, they work the same way. So there's a molecule called the NMDA receptor. And the way that Lauren's disease worked was that her body made an antibody that sort of blocked the NMDA receptor. And PCP also works by inhibiting function of that same receptor. The difference, obviously, is if you use PCP, it wears off eventually, whereas when you have this disease process, you're essentially chronically making these dangerous antibodies. So it's almost like you're kind of on a drip of PCP. The effect never really goes away. Versus, if you use PCP once, you'll eventually be fine again. So it's sort of a wild pathophysiology. And the way that it works is, at a cognitive perspective, it essentially sort of unhooks your perception of reality from inputs from the external environment. So normally what we do is we sort of modify our thoughts and our perceptions of reality using input from what's going on around us. But these sort of disease processes and PCP as a drug sort of unhooks that. So you're sort of subject to the reality that you create in your mind. It's called dissociation.
I think about this sometimes it's like deconstruction back to the exactly what is causing what, and then how the person is taking it, and after that. So then, do we ever think of some drugs are being used by some individuals to counter something that is, let's say, off, or there's a missing, there's a piece that's not functioning appropriately, but when they use it, it's like a temporary fix, and so they're kind of trapped in that scenario for many years because they're trying to like put a plug into a socket, but it just keeps coming out, and that's the drug.
Yeah, those are drugs sort of patching a hole and not fixing the underlying problem. I think it's an interesting question. I think we think of that often with, using antidepressants versus doing talk therapy. And in some ways we think about, some people benefit from talk therapy and it allows them to develop skills to cope with events that come up. And then when something else challenging comes up, they develop the skills to cope with it. And some people, that's not as effective, and actually taking medications that alter the brain chemistry is more effective. But if they go off of the medications in the future, they may be fine, but some of them have trouble.
Actually, on that one, a curiosity at the current moment versus, let's say, 10 years ago, is there a higher ratio of people in society that are using some sort of mind-altering medication than 10 years ago? Or is it less, or is it about the same, would you say?
I've never seen statistics about it, so I'm not sure. I have no idea. I think
okay.
I would say, my impression is that they're very common now, and that 20 years ago they weren't as common. But I've never read a statistic about it.
Fair. My guess or such would be along the same lines of what you were saying. It just seems like it's been more targeted, whereas before things that were more physical, like heart or skin, or things that were more mechanical were targeted, and then in more recent times, as we got more advanced, we're getting more and more into our brain. Seems like. Fair. That's funny. I'm like describing it, and here do I have a neurologist, but I'm just my gut feeling.
No, I think you're right. I think your gut feeling's good.
That's good. So that is Lauren, and which is not her actual. That's like a pseudonym.
Exactly.
Name, by the way, Lauren. Yeah, cool. So onward we go to another who may also have a pseudonym or not, Danny Goodman, and Danny has a question of whether his father has been recently witnessed. Why would Danny ask such a question, and what molecule is being spoken about in that example?
Yeah, so this is a chapter I wrote about a guy named Danny Goodman and his son, who I called Russell. And these are, again, actually, it's all pseudonyms in the book. But the other details are I tried to keep to the truth. So Danny Goodman was this incredibly successful entrepreneur. He had, been in fast food restaurants. He'd done arts and crafts stores, and eventually he settled on this business where they sold wine. And it became this extraordinarily successful business. And he started it later in life. He started in his sort of 50s or 60s. And he wasn't particularly tech savvy, but it was an online business primarily. And it just took off. And he was doing extremely well, and he needed someone to join the business at a high level. And he actually invited his son, Russell, who I call Russell, to join the business. And Russell at the time was a molecular biologist. He didn't have any training in selling wine, but he liked the idea of working in the family business, and it was doing well. So he decides to join his dad at work. And everything's going well until about 6 months later, when Russell notices that his dad's less friendly than he used to be. His father used to give him a hug when they would get to work, and he just really stopped doing that. And first Russell thinks, maybe we're working together. Maybe he just feels like, it should be a more sort of business-like relationship when we're here. But then things get a little stranger, and Danny starts putting lots of exclamation points in the ads online. And he starts asking strange questions. So they looked at a financial summary from February, and he asked, where's the 29th and 30th? So sort of unusual questions for someone who runs a sort of mammoth business very successfully in the past. He stopped answering his phone, so people would call and the phone would just ring, and he would really feel no motivation to open it. And he started eating pizza to the point where he would, gain lots of weight, whereas before he was someone who had a relatively reasonable diet. He really seemed to have no insight that he should have a, more diverse diet. He would just eat pizza all the time. And he would order DVDs online, and he would just order multiple copies of the same DVD. He would get, hundreds and hundreds of DVDs delivered. So it's just these really strange behaviors. And he starts looking at pornography at work. And this is a computer that faces the door. So it really was just very, very out of character behavior. And he starts getting diagnoses. Some people think that he has ADD. Some people think it's related to back pain. But his son, with his molecular biology background, actually starts to wonder whether this is a problem related to their DNA. And he knows that he has this family history. There's been some other relatives that have had unusual cognitive changes later in life. One of them had problems with speech, and some of them had problems with movements. And so his son, Russell, starts to wonder whether maybe actually there could be a problem with their DNA. And sure enough, they go to a neurologist, and they're told that he has a condition called frontotemporal dementia, which is a condition that causes these classic symptoms of people who are disinhibited. They may go up to strangers. They can be hypersexual. They can say sort of inappropriate things that they wouldn't otherwise say. They often become apathetic, where they just they're not depressed, but they have no motivation to do anything. They might be happy just sitting and staring at a wall all day. They can be what's called hyperoral, so they might have strange eating behavior. Sometimes they'll eat, they'll only eat chips, or they'll chew gum, and they need to chew gum all the time. They can get sort of rituals like that. And they can have some other symptoms. And in about 20% of people, and Danny Goodman was one of these people, the disease is caused by a genetic mutation. And so in the book, I write about Russell's experience deciding whether or not to get tested himself for the disease. He knew he had for the mutation. He was totally normal. He is totally normal. And he has a 50% chance of getting that genetic mutation when he was conceived. And he went through genetic testing and found out that he actually carries that mutation. Even though he has no symptoms, he carries that mutation. That puts him at high risk for developing symptoms in the future. And so what I write about in the book is sort of their whole family story and Russell's sort of techniques for coping and how he thinks about all of it.
One thing, as you mentioned that, it made me think, I have told people before that I could stare at a wall and be fine, but I don't think I have the condition. It's just that I am content in existence. A little comparison came to mind.
All of these, though, and I'll say we get people all the time where they've been diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia and they have one or two symptoms, but it really is a question of, as a whole story, are we getting this picture? So the diagnosis is made by having a constellation of symptoms, not a single thing.
That's true. Should the average person be worried about, how worried should they be about dementia at different ages? What's the likelihood of that occurring? And is it dangerous, or just something that you should deal with?
So if you take the average 65-year-old who's cognitively normal, there's about, give or take, there's about a 25% chance that they'll develop dementia. before they die. So it's not 100%, it's not 75%, but it's not a small proportion. And so that's a sort of a good benchmark statistics. That number is sort of tinkered with by different risk factors. So if you have relatives with dementia, that might change it a little bit. If you have certain genetic factors that can increase the risk, that can change things. Women have a higher risk. People who are African American have a higher risk. And in general, the risk goes up over time. So the older you are, the higher your risk is going to get for dementia. And so that's sort of a way to think about it. And then in our clinic, we use other factors to try to better understand whether someone is developing dementia or will develop dementia. And we also use things like, cognitive testing to see if they're abnormal. We look at imaging. We may look at other things that could contribute or cause their symptoms.
On that one, what are some of the most common issues that you deal with as a neurologist that people come to you for?
So I'm sort of in cognitive neurology. So I'm mostly a dementia doctor. That's what I see. So most of the people who come to see me are saying, is there something neurodegenerative going on, or is this normal? They're saying, what's causing my symptoms? And dementia itself is sort of a non-specific term. It basically it refers to how someone's functioning in the everyday world. So there's something called mild cognitive impairment, and there's dementia. Normal is someone who has normal functioning and their cognitive testing is normal. Mild cognitive impairment is someone who notices things that are a little more difficult in everyday life, but they're doing everything they always used to do. When we do cognitive testing, we can pick up the things that are abnormal, but the person is still completely functional in the outside world. What dementia means is the person's unable to do things that they used to be able to do because of memory and thinking. Like they can't manage the finances at all anymore, and they've had to ask someone else to take it over because they were making too many errors. Or they can't drive anymore because they got lost too many times. That's what dementia is. But it turns out there's lots of causes of dementia. So dementia is just a description of what it looks like when someone moves about the everyday, moves about the world. The causes of dementia actually are differentiated based on what they look like under a microscope. And so oftentimes this is after people pass away. If in research protocols, we look at a piece of the brain under a microscope and we look at what abnormal proteins we're seeing in the brain. And then that's often the cause of dementia. So when we say something like someone has Alzheimer's disease, what we mean is that if I look at a piece of their brain, I would see two proteins. One is amyloid and one is called tau. That's what Alzheimer's disease means. It's that there's buildup of amyloid and tau proteins in the brain. So it's a description of what's going on under a microscope versus dementia is a description of what's going on in the real world with someone.
Can most issues that a person comes in with be identified using different indicators? Or are there some that are not easily identified thus far? How easy is it to, once you examine something, say, you're 32% at this level, you're at this level? Is it that directly able to be seen?
So most people that we see, we come to some sort of idea of, we think this is neurodegenerative and progressive, or we don't think it's neurodegenerative and progressive. Some of the people were able to say, look, we have almost proof that this abnormal protein is building up in your brain. But a lot of people, we aren't able to say that. We're able to say, like, we think this is going to progress over time. Here are the symptoms that we think are going to arise in the future. But if I looked under a microscope, I can narrow it down to some proteins that I think I'd see, but I'm not positive which one.
That's cool. I like that we're getting a lot more insight through so many patients over time and combined research. It's like we get to figure out everything a little bit. Now, returning to patients of sorts, we have a bellows and related molecule. What is the scenario in this one?
I'm trying to remember hold on, I have to go back and maybe just, let me have you, hold on one second, I have to go back and look up that chapter. Give me just a moment.
Mike Bellows?
That Mike Bell. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the first name. That was what it was. I'm missing the first name.
I forgot the first name too.
Right.
That's on me.
So Mike Bellows was a guy who met the love of his life in high school, but was a little bit too intimidated to ask her out, and they ended up going their separate ways. And they each got married. They each had kids.
Which happens in life.
Right, not actually an uncommon story. But they each had kids. And then they ended up separating from their first partners. And then he meets this woman again in the general store in their town some years later, and asks her out. And they end up sort of becoming a couple. And they start dating, and he decides he wants to propose to her. And so he buys a ring, and the plan is to propose to her in Turks and Caicos, where they're going for her birthday. And so he gets everything ready. But in the lead up to the trip, he starts sort of changing. They go on this trip that he's been going on every year with friends to the beach. And normally he's a really sort of outgoing, friendly, extrovert type guy. And on this trip, he just seems to be a little bit introverted, a little bit angry. He sort of would put his chair on the other side of the beach. Whenever he talks to people, he kind of looks away. And his girlfriend notices that things just look different. And he starts getting into drinking, and he starts smoking again. And he just seems to be sort of becoming more agitated and more anxious than he was before. Wasn't really an anxious guy by nature. And so, but in the midst of that, he's planning to propose, and he buys a ring, and they go to Turks and Caicos. And they get to the hotel, and he gets extremely agitated and punches a hole in the wall. His girlfriend ends up having to call security. And the week goes on like that, with them essentially sort of not being able to get back to where they were, which had been a very successful, loving relationship. And so they fly back home, and his girlfriend sort of doesn't know what to do. This seems totally out of character. And she comes down one day, and comes downstairs one day, and he's sitting in the kitchen, and he says, essentially, let's go fishing. And it sort of comes out of nowhere. And he's sort of wearing wearing boots and holding a fishing rod. And it's like the middle of the night. Right. It's the middle of the night. But he sends her text messages saying, that must be so scary. And he seems to think that she's like a spider outside his car window. At one point, he thinks he's the president. He's on his motorcycle in the yard at one point, mimicking as if he's going through a toll booth. So he just gets more and more strange behavior. And eventually he ends up going to the hospital, and he starts developing these actually whole body contractions. And they're incredibly violent, to the point where he almost bites off his own tongue. They're just very, very dramatic. And he ends up getting bounced around from hospital to hospital to rehabs for months, and no one can figure out what's going on. He's intubated, so he has a breathing tube, but he has a feeding tube. It's just sort of, he's gone from being a normal person to being an extraordinarily sick person over a short period of time. And eventually he ends up at a hospital where someone actually recognizes his symptoms. And they recognize that the syndrome that he has is actually caused by an autoimmune process, where his immune system is attacking what's called the glycine receptor. So there's a neurotransmitter called glycine that's really important to help you relax. So when you want to relax down, when you want to sort of relax your arm to the chair or something like that, glycine is really what helps you in the spine to relax your muscles. It helps neurons send that signal to your muscles to sort of let go of tension. In his case, that receptor wasn't getting the right signals, and that's what was causing the symptoms. It's a little bit akin to tetanus. And once this doctor diagnosed him, he was treated, and he actually eventually, they took the breathing tube out, they took the feeding tube out, and he went home eventually and proposed to the woman that he wanted to propose. He bought a different ring because he decided that ring was sort of bad luck after all they'd been through. But he eventually did propose to her.
One thing that comes to mind there, it's a fun story, by the way. That's an interesting story. How often or how common is it that patients will go to one location and then nothing really comes to mind and they get sent somewhere else? Is that common, or is it only in rare cases?
I think it's really common. The statistic that I've read is that if you take all the complaints that go to a primary care doctor, about 1 in 5 are what's called medically unexplained, where we don't find an answer. And a lot of those people will go looking for answers at another, their doctor's office. And sometimes it's really great because you end up seeing someone who has the answer, and that's fantastic. And you say, thank God I saw this person. Thank God I kept pursuing this. And other times, people go from doctor to doctor to doctor, and their chart gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So every time they go to a new doctor, it becomes even more difficult to sift through what actually happened. And they don't end up finding answers. And it's really hard to know that balance as a patient. How far should you push things? I always think it's really important to be with a doctor where you feel comfortable asking them questions and bringing up possible new diagnoses.
Is it more common that an unidentified issue is found, like it has to be in person with a doctor, or that it's found through researching online or some records or other cases?
I've never seen an actual study of that. I have no idea. I guess I'm biased and I like to think that we're better than Google. but right. I've never seen a statistic about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not like, like Google or I guess that'd be kind of tough to put in what the elements are of that person. Yeah, it pretty much has to be in person. Most things that are good in life, they're in person. It's very difficult to do almost anything. I think of it as terms of like bandwidth. The highest bandwidth is in person, all the way down video, then audio, then text. The lower the bandwidth, the less you can discern all the key elements, and now you've created a more difficult puzzle for yourself in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think about that for people relating to. It's like, through text, you can only 1,000 texts might be worth 1 minute of video time or less than that, because there's so much you pick up versus that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder whether that calculus changed with the pandemic, when now we've become so much more used to sort of virtual meetings.
That's true. One thing I think is cool though is that that element is in full video. If this has happened 20 years ago, it might have been like just maybe audio or even text. Now that would have been kind of shaky material. A lot of classes, I have to throw this in, but a lot of classes have like a teacher and then like 20 students that their camera is not there, and then the teacher's like talking into an abyss. That is a funny element of the recent period.
Yeah.
Just had to throw that in there.
I think that's a common thing. And then I think some people have made rules that you have to have I know there was a class that I taught, and there was a rule that you had to have your camera on.
That's cool. Actually, on that one, have you enjoyed teaching? And when you're teaching, do you think about, is everybody on the same page here? Or as a teacher, do you think some people might not be so fully invested in this, and that's okay? I was talking about this with somebody like a couple of days ago.
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to get I don't know, maybe I'm not a good enough teacher, but I'm never going to get everyone to be 100% enthusiastic about everything. And I think when I think of the classes that I've taken, some of them that I love, I know other people haven't liked. And so I think the main thing though is that, at least in the class that I taught was an undergrad class about sort of the history of neuroscience. And but I think there's always going to be people who are more interested than other people. But the main thing is that there has to be, some sort of participation from people and some sort of give and take in conversation. And the same way as, we think of that as a life skill. Everyone you talk to isn't going to have the most interesting thing to say, but part of communicating with people in work and personal setting is being able to talk to people who may be, less interesting, but engaging with them and asking questions and and pushing the conversation, even though it's not the best thing you've ever heard. And I think the same way with classes, part of it is learning how to engage with new material, whether or not it's your favorite material or not.
I have to add in, this is a pointer in the moment. I have noticed that Sara has I'll call it like a humbleness to your descriptions about how you're teaching or may not be the best. The people who say that always, I found in my existence, and I've mentioned this before, are actually more aware and understanding, and yet they're still kind of like pulling back, versus the person who maybe doesn't have as much depth or understanding, but they're not going to include that part, just hoping that people are fully with them. So it's almost like communication is almost, not always, but generally like an opposite of what's actually occurring I have this theme of that where it's always like the person who is worried about being around people might present themselves as though they're, no, I'm good. And the person who's great with people will actually pull it back in a more humble way. But they are actually good with people. Communication there. That's not it. Now, on this point of personality qualities, I always throw in, I'm very people-oriented in personality qualities. What are 3 traits of your own that you identify with or that come to mind that you're like, this is me, or these things relatively describe me in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought about that in a really long time. I'm trying to think. Yeah. I've always been a little bit spaced out. That at my wedding, my parents made fun of this, that even as a kid, I was always sort of lost in thought. Yeah, but I think that's always been my my sort of general feel in conversation, that sometimes my thoughts will run away to something else. So I think I've always been a little bit spaced out.
You have like a networking mind.
Maybe that's a complimentary way to put it. A nice euphemism. And then I'm just trying to think. I tend to be generally sort of even-tempered, I guess. I'm not the most sort of outgoing person that you'll meet by any means. I don't know. I have to think about a third. I wish I had prepared for this.
That's a great point. Yeah, that first one you mentioned, it jumped to my mind automatically. It might be described as spaced out, but what is that person doing? They're connecting this concept with that concept, linking a variety, whereas some people are more like A, B, C, and it has to be on a direct linear path, which is more like the basic framework that is easy to deal with. But all the cool things in life come from the linkage of various things, like the Santa Fe Institute I always talk about. It's a multidisciplinary science place that can combine economics and physics and other. That's where the great answers come from, versus if only chemists stuck with chemists and followed the line of chemists and never got, spaced out or went to a different space in some way, then we're so limited.
Yeah, and I think actually, so one of the chapters in the book is about the people who discovered the location of the gene that causes Huntington's disease. And actually the way that was discovered was a woman who, she herself was at risk for Huntington's disease and now has actually developed the disease. And she and her father created these workshops where people from across different scientific disciplines would come together and talk about trying to sort of synthesize a scientific approach for finding the gene. And it was very much that attitude of, we need to bring people out of their comfort zones, bring people who have different areas of expertise. They weren't allowed to bring any slide sets because the idea was you can't rely on your, what's rote. And they had relatively small groups. It was, I think, something like, 20 people or less. And the idea was exactly what you're saying. You have to collaborate across different disciplines. I have to say the book really comes from the same idea. I mean, I don't really have any training in writing. And so my training is mostly I have some basic science training, and then and my training's in medicine, and actually getting into the idea of narrative medicine and physician writing. It's a really neat sort of crossover interface, and it's a budding field. And so I think I very much feel like I've benefited from being sort of at the seams.
I like that you point that out, because each thing is a thing. So, for example, if you are in medicine, taking that and now doing some narrative writing, it might seem like, oh, okay, you're just applying it. But that's like, you're definitely now adding in a category to your existence that wasn't there previously. There's a lot of steps involved, people to contact, things to figure out. It may seem straightforward because the link is closer than like if you just suddenly start doing accounting, let's say. But it's still another thing. In life, we have to really make an effort, I think, to add another thing, even if it's in a related field, and very few do that. So maybe if there was a number of people in the same field, maybe only 2% might reach out to combine it with this or with this. It's not automatic. I think the average person might think it's so straightforward, like you could just do that. We can do everything, but how many things will we actually set aside time and energy to add on to what we were doing?
Yeah, I think
not too many, right? We have the short.
I think it's helpful when people choose things though that have some overlap. So at least for medicine and writing, and I didn't realize this until I wrote the book, that when I see patients, a lot of what I'm doing is I'm listening to their story, and then I'm trying to distill it down into a narrative that tells a sort of coherent, logical tale of what's happened to them. And it leads up to a logical conclusion of, and therefore this is the diagnosis, this is what's going on, and this is the right treatment. And that's actually the same skill that you use when I was writing these stories, is how do I create this summary, essentially, that describes what happened to someone, what it's like for them to be in existence, what has changed for them, and how do I lead the reader into a diagnosis that makes sense? So they say, oh, that fits with what I've just heard. Oh, no, I could have seen that coming. Something like that.
As a writer, what would you say makes a story compelling, or does it have any certain elements that are necessary where someone will want to continue it? Does anything come to mind in that category?
So I think this is what I try to work out in the book is there's always has to be something that you want to know. If there's nothing more that you want to know, you're going to put the book down. And so a lot of it is about setting up a situation where you want to know a piece of information that you haven't learned yet. That's the only thing that keeps people reading. So in the book that I wrote, some of it is, showing people a dramatic change in someone's personality or their existence. And then the goal is for the reader to say, oh, I really want to read on to figure out what happened to them. I want the explanation. I want to know what's going to happen to them also. Not only, what's the disease process that caused this, but is this person going to recover? Are they going to live? And in order to get someone to care about that, you have to get them to care about the character itself. So some of what I'm doing in the book is also trying to create a full picture of these people, because they are very much sort of complex, intricate, and fascinating people, at least, in my own biased opinion. It's a part of that is trying to get the reader to be attached to these people, attached to the characters, so they want to know what's the outcome.
Makes sense. You're connecting with them as people. Now they are part of your world. One thing that I always like to check on is, were there any key people in your path that provided you a direction, like a fork in the road, that led you to where you are currently? Or was it not that at all?
No, I was lucky. I had a mentor in college, and then a mentor in my graduate school program they were basic scientists, and they were incredible teachers about teaching me essentially how to think about science in a more sort of critical way. How do you design experiments? And even though I didn't end up doing science, I think that gave me the background to write about medicine in this way. And then they also, my mentor for what would have been my PhD was wonderful to me. And when I came up to him and said, I think I don't want to finish this program. I think I want to go back to medical school. I don't think I want to have a lab. It was a big life shift, and he was wonderful to me. He, treated me as a whole person, and he was great. Yeah, so I was really lucky with that, and then and I've been really lucky with the neurology department where I work has been incredibly supportive, and they've sent me patients that might be interested in being interviewed. They've been incredibly enthusiastic, even though writing in medicine is still a little bit sort of left field, and they've been wonderful to me. And then I've had other people outside of my own institution who've also helped. The head of the American Academy of Neurology, she's also a physician writer, and she's been incredibly supportive, and she's been a wonderful mentor for me. I'm trying to think. I'm sure obviously lots of people. I guess the other thing that was critical in the book, I actually wrote a lot of the book, and then I gave it to a mentor at Penn, and he said, have you talked to these scientists? And I had written about lots of scientists who were alive, and I hadn't actually talked to them yet. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. I guess maybe they would respond to me. And I emailed them, and literally almost every living scientist in the book, I was actually able to talk to them. The only exception is it was Nancy Wexler, and I was able to talk to her sister. And so that was incredibly lucky. And actually very much changed how I wrote the science. It made me realize I had to, people pointed out all these mistakes that I had made, and I was glad to be able to correct it according to the people who had really done the experiments.
I'm very fond of the point you just made, where even in this case, Dr. Sara Manning Peskin was wondering, wait, would these individuals respond to me? What's going to happen here? You reached out, and then afterwards, you're like, wait a minute, I like that part, because that's the shift from it's maybe out of my bounds or an overreach versus That would be great. And maybe they're glad on their end too. Isn't that a nice feature?
Yeah, it was really nice. I was totally shocked at how quickly I got responses from people. And I think it was an unusual interest, unusual request. I think it was also neat for them to talk with someone, to have their research highlighted.
One of my key elements in my existence has always been believing in oneself, self-esteem, reaching out, trying things, taking risks, being bold in some way. And so I've always focused heavily on the distinction between the first part of what you said and leading to the second part of what you said, and the difference between there. Because one part of it is like, I don't know, but me, I'm just this, versus the second part is like, I am part of the full framework, and this is cool, and it would be nice. There's like a belief that comes with that, and then that's taken forever. It's not like you forget it the next day. It could be a year from now, and you're just like, that's true, I was part of this element that people were glad to include. It's very building in a way. That's a cool one. Self-esteem, very important. I would like to check, my last question for you is, are there any, what kind of, do you read any books in the same category? Is there any content you take in? Where do you learn things or check out things at the current time?
Yeah, so I think in terms of things that are in the category, the three sort of models that I took for this were, one, Oliver Sacks is he defined the field of writing about neurologic illness for the lay audience, for the lay public. He really created this as an entity. And he very much is still sort of the top of how do you describe what happens to a patient with a neurologic disease. And then Siddhartha Mukherjee, who wrote Gene and Emperor of All Maladies, he's just a beautiful writer, and he's sort of the model of how do you tell the story of scientists discovering something. He just sort of tells it as rather than, here's a bunch of facts, he brings things alive, and he's just a beautiful narrator. And then the other person I came across more towards the end of writing the book, but who's just a wonderful sort of scientific describer, is Bill Bryson. He just writes about things. He writes about complicated scientific ideas in ways that are accessible and funny. And he does a great job also of moving from topic to topic at a pace that feels comfortable. So those are the people I think in the field that I try to sort of bring in for each of their particular skill sets.
On the mention of Siddhartha, I would like to say that I found out about him. I kind of saw his book indirectly from before, but he has a good friend, Dr. Azra Raza, who's in New York. She's been a past guest on the show, and she told me quite a bit about him and his storytelling ability, and I thought he was cool. And then one time while I was in there visiting her, we had dinner, and I was on the bus, the transport in New York, and there was somebody in the transport that was reading his book, so I took a picture of it and sent it to her, like, this is happening right now, people are sharing the content. He has a good story, the one about the gene. I think it's called the gene, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
He's a great author of sorts, and won a Pulitzer Prize or some
his first book did.
Pulitzer.
Yeah, so hard to complain about that.
Yes. Darn it, I won this award of sorts. That's cool. We all kind of are interlinked. This is a wonderful thing. Dr. Sara Manning Peskin, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode of the show, showcasing a little bit from this wonderful book, A Molecule Away from Madness. By the way, the back, it's super cool. When I saw this, I thought this is action-packed. I always look at the details of books. Glad to have you on here and bringing a lot of knowledge for all of us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Glad to. And we are out.